Hey guys, tonight we travel somewhere muddy, loud, and wildly different from your Pinterest perfect idea of a wedding. Imagine a dirt road worn down by ox carts and clogs. Chickens flap out of your way as you duck under a thatched archway cobbled together with branches and last season's dried flowers. Drums thud in the distance. A neighbor just yelled, "Woo!" while dropping his wooden mug into a trough. Yep. You're at a medieval wedding and you probably won't survive this in one piece. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge toward the commotion. Mud squishes around your ankles with every step. It's early spring, so the whole village smells like compost and fermented cabbage. But people are smiling. Some are already dancing. Others are helping themselves to suspicious-looking pies from a long wooden bench covered in cloth. No one seems to mind that the pigs are rooting underneath it. The bride is over there, barefoot, hair braided with straw cheeks flushed, and wearing what might technically count as white. She's laughing nervously while a neighbor adjusts her linen veil. The groom, you assume, is the one with the loudest voice and the biggest tankard of ale. He's shouting something about goats being the best dowry anyone's ever received. 2 of those goats are currently tied to a fence and chewing the bride's bouquet. You think of modern weddings, all the floral arrangements, cake tastings, monogrammed cocktail napkins. Here, someone just handed you a roasted onion on a stick and called it the first course. Still, this is a big deal. The entire community has gathered. Weddings weren't just about 2 people coming together, they were a social reset button. A new family unit meant new alliances, new labor forces, and hopefully, new babies. Even if the road was muddy, this was the cleanest slate most villagers ever got. And despite the rowdiness, there's ritual here. The bride and groom walk 3 times around a tree near the center of the square. The elders hum an old tune that sounds like a sheep chant turned lullaby. Someone throws handfuls of grain over the couple, not rice, but oats, because they're easier to sweep and less likely to attract bandits. The couple stops in front of a makeshift altar. It's just a wooden plank propped up on barrels, but it's the designated wedding table. An older man steps forward, maybe a village priest, or maybe just the guy with the best memory for Latin. He mumbles something half holy, half improvised. No one really minds that the blessing sounds like a shopping list. He's got a good voice, and people like tradition, even if it's fuzzy on the details. There's no formal I do no kiss the bride moment. Instead, the couple clutches hands, stares at each other for a full minute, and then the groom places a garland on her head, fresh leaves if possible. Wilted ones, if not. Symbolism's flexible. You notice something missing. No ring. No bouquet toss. No string quartet hiding behind a hedge. Just neighbors clapping, dogs barking, and a guy accidentally setting part of his sleeve on fire while lighting a torch. Still, there's an energy here, a rough warmth. Everyone's sweaty, slightly drunk, and carrying baskets of food or tiny gifts, a comb carved from bone, a new wool scarf, a flask of something that smells like apples and despair. These aren't luxuries, they're tokens of trust. Because in a world where survival was hard, community was everything. And a wedding, that was the ultimate group project. A couple of boys race around the edge of the gathering, whacking each other with sticks and pretending to joust. An old woman swats at them with a broom and mutters about how weddings used to be dignified. But her eyes are twinkling. She's seen enough seasons to know that chaos means life, and life means hope. Historians still argue whether village weddings followed any consistent script. Some say local customs varied so wildly that a normal wedding was impossible to define. Others think oral traditions kept the basics stable across generations, even if no one could agree on who officiated or which sheep were sacred. By now you've been offered a 3rd mug of ale and something someone insists is festive stew. You're not sure what makes it festive, but it might be the mushrooms, or the singing, or the faint sound of someone vomiting behind a cart. A trio of musicians starts playing. One has a lute, one's banging a pot, and the third is blowing into what looks like a goat bladder stretched over a stick. It somehow works. People cheer. Dancing begins. It's not elegant. It's stompy and full of elbow jabs. But it's joyous. A girl in a patched red tunic grabs your hand and yells, "Spin, stranger," and suddenly you're twirling through the dirt, trying not to trip over a chicken. You catch a glimpse of the couple again. They're holding hands, sharing a loaf of bread, grinning like fools. Their whole life together starts in this messy, noisy, slightly flammable moment. And honestly, it fits. Because love in the Middle Ages wasn't about spotless linens or choreographed entrances. It was about surviving with someone through plague, frost, taxes, and all. And if you could laugh together during your wedding feast, even while stepping in pig droppings, well, maybe you'd be okay. You blink, and suddenly everyone is cheering again. Not for a kiss, not for a bouquet toss, but because the bride just sat down without tripping over her skirt. A woman nearby leans over and whispers proudly, "Hasn't fallen once." That's a good omen. You nod like you understand what that means. There's no ring to admire, no velvet box, no surprise proposal under candlelight. In fact, you ask someone quietly, discreetly about the ring, and the reply is a snort and a shake of the head. "Rings for peasants," she laughs. "You're lucky if you get bread and a blanket." Welcome to a world where jewelry wasn't part of the starter pack. Wedding rings existed, sure, but they were mostly for the wealthy, and even then they weren't required. The church talked about them, Latin poets praised them, but your average medieval farmer wasn't about to spend a month's wages on a circle of shiny metal that could slip off into a pig pen. A firm handshake, a witness or two, and you were as married as anyone wearing gold. Instead of rings, many couples exchanged oaths. Spoken aloud, sometimes muttered shyly, sometimes yelled over a fiddler's melody, these promises sealed the deal. The words didn't have to be fancy, they just had to be mutual. "I take you" was enough, as long as someone soberish heard you say it. In England, for example, hand fasting became a well-known practice, a kind of informal betrothal, or even marriage sealed by clasped hands. Some took it so seriously that the couple would tie their sleeves together and jump a broomstick, though historians still debate which cultures did what and when. Folk customs wove through the marriage process like ivy, messy, tangled, impossible to prune clean. You notice now how many people are touching hands, old couples, new lovers, even best friends. There's something sacred in the grasp, a signal of intent, of shared labor ahead. In a world where paper contracts were expensive and ink could freeze in the winter, a squeeze of fingers said everything. Not that noble families skipped jewelry entirely. Oh no. If you belong to the gentry, you might sport a flashy ring with a carved seal useful for stamping wax or intimidating lesser lords. But even then, a marriage might happen long before any fancy band appeared. And it wasn't about romance. Rings were receipts. And if you lost it, you'd better hope you didn't lose the marriage too. You walk past the wedding table again. It's covered in cups, broken crusts, and one surprisingly well-drawn donkey. A little boy with berry-stained lips is proudly showing off his artwork. "This is the bride's new donkey," he declares. "I named it after my uncle." The bride beams. And then, just as things seem calm, someone from the back of the crowd starts arguing, loudly, about whether this marriage counts. Turns out not everyone agrees what makes a wedding legal. Is it the vows? The presence of a priest? The physical consummation? That part earns a few winks. Historians still argue the same thing. Canon law, common law, and local law often overlapped and contradicted. Some sources claimed two people were married if they exchanged vows with intent. Others insisted you needed witnesses. Still others prioritized the church's blessing, though priests didn't always get the memo. In more rural spots, couples might marry under a tree, or in a kitchen, or outside a tavern. The result: chaos, beautiful, muddy chaos. In one corner, an elderly woman is telling the same story for the third time, how her cousin got married just by walking into the woods with a shepherd and coming back pregnant. Everyone nods, like this is both completely normal and mildly scandalous. You feel something tug at your sleeve. It's a girl, maybe 9 or 10, asking if you're going to promise anyone tonight. You tell her no. She shrugs. That's fine. The beer's good, though. And she skips away, leaving you holding a chipped mug of mead that's been offered and accepted at least 6 times already. There's a lot of joy here, but also tension. Because once those vows are said, however they're said, there's no going back. In many places, marriage was binding, permanent, and nearly impossible to undo. And without the trappings, we now consider obvious rings, legal papers, official photographs. It could also be confusing. Imagine saying "I do" during a festival slightly drunk, only to realize 2 weeks later that it actually counted. And yes, that happened. Enough times that courts later had to step in and sort out messy cases. Was it a joke? Was it binding? Did anyone remember the exact words? Did someone write it down? If not, it might come down to witnesses, and whether they were too busy dancing to notice. You step away from the crowd for a moment. The moon's out. Somewhere an owl calls. It's quiet just for a second. And you think, what would you do standing in this time with no ring, no contract, and just a handful of words between you and a lifetime? A cold wind picks up. Back near the fire, someone's playing a melancholy tune now. The bride and groom are sitting side by side on a log, their shoulders touching. They're not talking, just staring at the flames. It's oddly beautiful. Not flashy, not grand. Just real. You turn back toward the noise, the laughter, the stomping feet. No jewelry, no DJs, just promises made by hand, voice, and presence. The kind of wedding that left mud on your boots, but something warmer under your skin. The music thumps again, but this time it's not joyous. It's tense. A low drum beat, steady and ominous, like someone's pacing in a circle. You follow the sound to a group gathered around a pair of old men arguing animatedly about cows. Well, technically the cow equivalent of what you might call a bride price. You edge in closer and realize what's happening. They're negotiating. Not about flowers or table arrangements, but about how many chickens, goats, or bundles of grain the bride's family is owed in return for letting her go. Yep. Welcome to the economics of medieval marriage, where love takes a back seat to livestock. Marriage in this time isn't just about 2 people. It's a deal, a contract, a complicated tangle of obligation and opportunity, often hammered out long before the couple even understands what's going on. Especially if you're a woman. Because let's be honest, you're not the one doing the haggling. Bride price or dowry depends where you are. In some regions, the groom pays the bride's father for taking her off his hands, usually in the form of animals' land or a labor agreement. In others, the bride's family gives a dowry to the groom, a financial incentive to take good care of her. Either way, it's a transfer of value, not affection. You overhear one man say she's strong, spins fast, good hips. He's not talking about a horse. He's talking about the bride. Her value apparently lies in how many blankets she can weave and how many children she might produce. You suddenly feel like you've walked onto the set of a medieval auction. The groom's uncle counters the land's bad. Her father's fields barely yield turnips. A murmur goes through the crowd. Turnips are serious business here. Historians still argue whether women were seen primarily as property or partners. The truth is likely both, and neither depending on the family, the village, and whether a famine was coming. Marriage negotiations weren't always cruel. Sometimes they were protective. A father might fight for a larger dowry not to sell his daughter, but to ensure she wouldn't starve in a bad marriage. And sometimes the bride herself would sneak her opinion into the conversation subtly, of course. You wander over to the bride's side of the field. She's talking with her mother in hushed tones. Her fingers twist the edge of her sleeve. Nervous, but not panicked. Just resigned. Like someone watching a cart full of apples roll away and thinking, well, I guess I'll make cider. You think about how much freedom she had in all this. The answer, not much. Some girls were married off as toddlers betrothed in name the actual wedding years away, but the agreement sealed nonetheless. Others were married at 12 or 13 just after their first period, because that's when you were officially ready. Childhood was short, and marriage came fast, and in many cases there was no romantic proposal, no kneeling, no nervous stammering in candlelight. Just a quiet exchange between fathers, a handshake, and the rolling of carts toward a new life. Sometimes, just sometimes, there was affection. You hear whispers about a village girl who ran away with a boy from another town. They lived in a hut by the river until her brothers dragged her home. No one knows what happened after. Some say they were secretly married. Others say the boy vanished. Folk stories like these cling to wedding traditions like burrs on wool. Someone beside you laughs and says, I remember my cousin's wedding. Her father promised a full goat and got half a chicken. Still calls it a fair trade. Another chimes in. At least she got something. My uncle gave his daughter away for a fishing net. Modern you is screaming inside. But medieval you just takes another bite of onion pie and tries not to ask too many questions. The bride price wasn't always livestock. Sometimes it was a job, a promised labor agreement, a future harvest. You imagine negotiating your marriage in hours worked. I'll marry your daughter if you plow my fields for 2 seasons and help me fix the barn roof. Romantic, no, but practical, incredibly. One of the musicians nearby breaks into a faster tune and the mood lifts again. The bride finally joins the dance. Her hair loosened, her eyes scanning the crowd for the groom. When she spots him, she smiles, not wide, not ecstatic, but gently, like someone who's made peace with her place in this ritual. You notice something else. No one's asking how they feel. No one's whispering, are you in love, or do you really want this? Because in the medieval mindset, those questions were luxuries. You didn't marry for butterflies, you married to survive. Even noble families treated marriage as strategy, aligning lands, combining fortunes, ending feuds. In royal circles, a wedding could be a declaration of war or peace, depending on who was invited and what kind of mead was served. And that trickled down. Everyone mimicked the nobles, even if their estate was 3 goats and a generous potato yield. Still, for all the bargaining, some brides and grooms found happiness. Not all arranged marriages were miserable. Many grew into companionship, mutual respect, even affection. But it didn't start with hearts. It started with hands and harvests. You move through the crowd again, watching people swap stories and haggle over the next cousin due to be married. One man jokes, I've got 2 sons and no bread. Anyone want to trade a bride for a sturdy roof? Everyone laughs, except the girl beside him. You step back, letting the music drift over you, letting the firelight soften the edges of these hard truths. Because underneath the haggling and mud and chicken-scented promises, there's something deeply human here. The search for connection, however imperfect, however brutal. And just maybe that's what kept people dancing, negotiated, tired, and bound by grain. The dancing slows as dusk slips deeper into night. Torches hiss in the damp air, their flames flickering low. A group of older women ushers the bride away gently but firmly into a nearby cottage. You follow curious and instantly feel the temperature shift. The air inside is thick with herbal smoke and whispered advice. A neighbor tosses dried lavender into a brazier, muttering something about fertility and goats. Naturally, the bride looks nervous and young, very young. Her mother adjusts the veil, smoothing it like it's a shield rather than a decoration. 12 winters, one woman says softly. She's ready. Another nods solemn. A little late if you ask me. You freeze. 12. You glance again at the girl, barely more than a child. Her cheeks still have the roundness of someone who plays more than she works. And yet here she is, married or nearly, and expected to start her adult life. It wasn't uncommon. Across much of medieval Europe, girls were considered marriageable by age 12, sometimes even earlier. Boys were typically older, 14, 16, sometimes 18, but not always. The church technically set legal ages, but enforcement was patchy at best. Life expectancy hovered around 30-40 if you were lucky, so everything started sooner. Childhood was more of a concept than a phase. You hear a woman whisper, "Her moon has come," hasn't it, referring, of course, to menstruation? That was the line. Once crossed, the assumption was simple: if you could bear children, you should. It's practical, sure, but also deeply unsettling when viewed through modern eyes. Historians still debate how common consummation was at such young ages. Some suggest the weddings were ceremonial, with the actual living together delayed until puberty completed. Others argue that especially among peasants, practical needs overrode waiting. A helping hand on the farm didn't require a maturity certificate. The bride doesn't cry. She just sits still, hands clenched in her lap as the women braid her hair into a married woman style, off the shoulders, pinned back with bone combs. One aunt hums a lullaby. Another is darning a hem. The calm is eerie. Outside, the groom paces. He's not much older, maybe 15, with a fuzzy chin and a nervous jawline. He keeps adjusting his belt like it might magically solve whatever anxiety he's feeling. A friend slaps him on the back. "You'll do fine," he says. "Just remember to breathe." You step back, watching both sides of this deeply unequal equation. Two kids nudged toward adulthood not by choice, but by custom and survival. Because for families, marriage meant transferring responsibility. A daughter married was a daughter fed by someone else. A son married was a future grandfather, and therefore a hope for more labor, more hands, more soup in the winter pot. It wasn't all grim. Some girls relished the attention of wedding day, the new dress, the songs, the chance to sit beside someone who might be kind. But affection was secondary to readiness. You didn't wait for butterflies. You waited for menstruation and a good harvest. A woman in the cottage picks up a tiny carved figure, Saint Margaret, protector of childbirth, and tucks it into the bride's pocket. "She'll need it," someone mutters. You feel a chill. You think about how differently time moved then. 12 wasn't childhood. It was transition. You weren't expected to dream. You were expected to do. Marry. Work. Reproduce. Repeat. Not that all marriages started this early. In wealthier or more urban communities, people sometimes married later, 18, 20, even 25 for some men. But in the countryside, where children were assets and disease was a roll of the dice, waiting too long meant risking lineage and legacy. The wedding wasn't just about two lives. It was about entire family trees grafted together like apple branches. The earlier the grafting started, the more apples you might maybe get. You exit the cottage just as the stars brighten. A group of boys are tossing stones at a tree trunk, placing bets on who will marry next. One boy shouts, "Not me, I'm staying free, like the fox." The others laugh. You wonder how long that promise will last. Down by the fire, an old man begins telling a story. It's about his wedding night, how he was 14, and his bride was 13, and how they had nothing but a borrowed blanket and a squeaky bed made of rope and hay. Everyone laughs, though there's something heavy in the air, like nostalgia wrapped in quiet sorrow. You look around. This isn't the fairy tale wedding scene of lace and lanterns. It's smoke-dirt, uncertain futures, and a girl with braids too tight and a face too pale. Yet for this community, it's not cruel. It's normal, which makes it more complicated. Historians still argue over how these girls felt. Diaries are rare. Testimonies are filtered through church courts or sensational chronicles. But scraps remain letters, prayers, stories. Some reveal affection, some fear, many confusion. And through it all, one truth endures. These were children asked to become adults with no pause between. You drift past a corner where two mothers whisper about their own wedding days. One remembers being so small her gown dragged in the mud. The other jokes, "I thought marriage meant more porridge." Turns out, it meant more laundry. Even the jokes feel tired. You settle near the fire again. The groom has stopped pacing. He's seated now, looking into the flames like they might tell his future. His father nudges him. "Best sleep while you can," he says. "Tomorrow you'll wake a man." And just like that, it's decided. No ceremony marks this shift. No rite of passage other than time pressure and necessity. Childhood ends not with a celebration, but a quiet folding of expectations. A nod from an elder. A braid tucked into place. A goat tied to a new fence. And for the girl in the cottage tomorrow brings a life of labor repetition and maybe, hopefully, a kind voice across the bed. You wake figuratively, not literally, in the early gray of morning. The fire's gone to embers. The music faded into hiccupy snores from nearby drunks, and the bride and groom have disappeared into the cottage. People murmur with approval. Someone tosses another log onto the fire and says, "Now they're really married." You raise an eyebrow. Weren't they already? You watched them vow, you saw the garland, the dancing, the awkward stew. But here, in the tangled customs of medieval matrimony, that wasn't quite enough. Marriage, you learn, has a strange center of gravity in this world. Words matter, yes, but consummation that seals it. The bedding of the couple, however private or public, is the final step. Without it, some would argue the marriage never really happened. It's like saying your vows, signing a contract, and then forgetting to press submit. This is where the concept of consent gets murky. You hear giggles and whispers from women near the cottage door. They've just finished the bedding ritual. And yes, it is exactly what it sounds like. The community didn't just assume the couple would share a bed. No, they escorted them there. Sometimes, literally. Sometimes singing ribald songs the whole way. Sometimes tossing coins on the bed for fertility. And sometimes, though, thankfully not tonight, they'd stay and watch. Not the act itself, usually, but enough to witness that the bed was entered, that the couple was tucked in, that the marriage was, as the phrase went, made flesh. You shiver. Some towns had official bed inspectors. Others relied on the testimony of midwives' relatives, or even neighbors who'd sneak a peek through the window. If bloodied bedsheets appeared the next day, confirmation of virginity and a good match. If not, well, expect lawsuits, annulments, or aggressive gossip from Aunt Gertrude. Historians still debate how widespread the bedding ceremony really was. In royal and noble households, it was formalized, recorded, documented, and sometimes attended by nobles carrying torches like it was the weirdest conga line in history. Among peasants, it was looser, sometimes symbolic, sometimes practical, always laced with awkwardness. You try to imagine your own wedding night being watched by extended family holding mugs of beer and shouting encouragement. Romance. Not so much. Pressure. Absolutely. And the bride. What was she supposed to feel in that moment? Excitement, dread, compliance. You think again of how young she looked, how nervous. Her options limited. her path pre-paved. Consent in the medieval context was slippery. Legally, the church insisted on mutual agreement, that both bride and groom had to want the union, but reality, especially for women, rarely aligned. If your father arranged it and your community expected it, and your priest encouraged it, did your yes really count? Or was it simply the only word you could say? There are stories, of course, about defiance. Women who refused to consummate, who ran away, who took lovers instead of husbands. And sometimes they paid dearly. Other times, they quietly rewrote the rules. One tale drifts your way from a nearby storyteller about a girl who married under pressure but refused to share a bed with her groom. She locked herself in a room for 3 nights. He gave up. She declared herself a spiritual bride of Saint Agnes. No one argued after that, especially not the goat who kept trying to chew the chapel curtains. You don't know if that story's true, but it lingers. The fire crackles again. Someone stirs a pot of oats. Life moves on. Because once the wedding is sealed, the expectations begin immediately. Work, children, church, survival. You're struck by how public everything is. From the vows to the bedding, nothing belongs entirely to the couple. Marriage is communal. Your choices ripple outward. Your bedroom is a political arena, and your fertility is everyone's business. Privacy. That's a future invention. Even the home the couple now shares isn't theirs alone. Odds are they'll sleep in the same one-room cottage as siblings' parents or cousins. A single bed for the entire household wasn't unheard of, just arranged by warmth, not romance. You imagine trying to build intimacy while your uncle snores 2 feet away. Not ideal, and yet somehow it worked. Life made space for love in the cracks. Quiet moments by the fire. A hand brushed against another during laundry. A joke shared while plowing the fields. Romance didn't need chandeliers, it needed presence. You walk past the cottage again now, quieter. A woman sits nearby, humming while spinning wool. "They'll be all right," she says to no one. Then to you, it's the first day that matters least. It's what comes after. You wonder what after looks like. For this couple, it might mean years of back-breaking work births and losses shared bread and cold winters. It might mean arguing over firewood or laughing at the same story for the 10th time. No one knows. That's the quiet miracle of it. Historians still argue whether the bedding ceremony was trauma or tradition. Maybe it was both. Maybe it depended on who stood at the edge of the bed and who dared to look away. One final murmur reaches your ears, a blessing muttered by a passing elder. May their bed be warm and their troubles few. You repeat it to yourself softly, and with that, the night sighs. The couple is bound. By vow, by flesh, by the silent agreement of every muddy shoe outside their door. There's no going back. And somehow, in the soft edges of this brutal tradition, something like tenderness glows. Dawn begins to pull itself up over the crooked rooftops. The sky is milk gray, and the ground is still wet enough that your boots make that satisfying schluck sound with every step. Around you, the wedding detritus remains overturned jugs, scattered oat husks, someone's sock dangling from a bush like a weird prayer flag. And yet, something has shifted. The village feels quieter, like it's collectively exhaling. But wait, you're confused. There were no church bells. Wasn't this a wedding? Shouldn't there have been an altar? A priest in ceremonial robes? Latin hymns? A holy toast? Nope. In this little corner of the Middle Ages, church weddings weren't guaranteed, or even expected, especially not for peasants. They were expensive, logistically tricky, and often optional. The modern idea that a wedding must take place inside a church witnessed by God and the parish bulletin just wasn't a thing for most people. You pass a group of elders shaking their heads. Fine enough wedding, one says, but no proper mass. Another replies, bah, they spoke vows. That's all that matters. A third adds, At least the pig didn't escape this time. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the church started cracking down, trying to formalize marriage, bring it under ecclesiastical control, but enforcement patchy at best. Canon law said you needed free consent spoken aloud, preferably in front of witnesses, but no specific formula. And definitely no need for a priest until later centuries started pushing the idea harder. You remember a scholar once writing that medieval marriage floated between heaven and hearth, which is a poetic way of saying sometimes it was sacred, sometimes it was just done. A couple could marry on a doorstep, or under a tree, or in a tavern, or while standing knee-deep in snow holding hands and muttering, "All right then." As long as both agreed and weren't already married, it counted. Of course, this legal squishiness created chaos. Historians still argue whether the church ever truly controlled marriage among the common folk. There are case records filled with people claiming to be married because of an old promise, a midnight hand fasting, or a drunken pact made in a hayloft. And if there were no witnesses, it was one person's word against another's, sometimes years later, with children and property on the line. You pass the village priest's home. It's small and unremarkable with a goat sleeping on the stoop. He's out back tending to a cabbage patch, utterly unconcerned that he didn't preside over last night's ceremony. You imagine him getting letters from the bishop. Encourage sanctified union, they say. Ensure all marriages are public and holy. And the priest sighing, muttering, "I can't even get them to show up for confession." Good luck with weddings. It's not that villagers didn't care about God. They did fervently. But religion was woven into every part of life, not just the church building. Blessings were whispered in kitchens, crosses carved into doorframes, saints called upon during childbirth, illness, and really bad stew. You come across a little altar tucked into the roots of a tree. Candles melted down to stubs, a carving of St. Joseph propped between mossy stones. Someone has left a crust of bread, maybe for a blessing, maybe for the birds. This was their chapel. Some couples did go to the church, especially if they were wealthier or lived near one. A formal ceremony might be held at the church porch, the liminal space between secular and sacred. Later, they'd step inside for Mass. But that was a luxury, not a baseline. And besides, scheduling a priest could be a nightmare. He might be traveling, or sick, or refusing to marry anyone until they tithed more barley. Or maybe he was just tired of officiating for couples who already acted married and only wanted the blessing because someone's aunt got judgmental. There's a story you overhear from a bearded man by the water barrel. His cousin once married 3 times, same woman, 3 ceremonies. First at a feast, second at the church for the records, and third time to reassert legitimacy when a neighbor challenged their inheritance. Marriage, he says, slapping the barrel is like ale. You gotta check it hasn't gone sour. You chuckle and nod, because it's messy. It always was. The idea that every wedding was a white-robed, incense-filled event is just, well, fiction. For most medieval folks, it was vows, hands bread, and trust. Maybe a prayer if someone remembered. And sometimes a priest if he wasn't too busy planting cabbages. You stroll back toward the main square. A few villagers are already sweeping, collecting mugs, stomping out the last embers of a fire. The bride's younger siblings chase each other around a stool, giggling. You ask a woman if the couple plans to go to church later. She shrugs. Maybe. If it rains? Which doesn't make sense, and somehow makes perfect sense. And maybe that's the heart of it. Medieval marriage was practical, flexible, and rooted more in community memory than paper records or holy water. Everyone saw you take vows. Everyone saw you share a bed. That was enough. But of course the church kept trying. Over the centuries, rules would tighten, ceremonies would standardize, registers would be written. Eventually, weddings would become what we expect today, structured, sacred, sealed with a kiss in front of pews and hymnals. But for now, a couple handfasted in the mud with their neighbors watching and their goats bleating, that's as real as it gets. You pause. The morning sun is catching the tops of the thatched roofs. A woman walks by carrying a basket of eggs, humming a hymn you don't recognize. Somewhere a bell rings, not from a chapel, but from a cow's neck. And you realize with a strange little smile that in this world, that counts as music for a honeymoon. The morning continues unfolding like a slow-baked loaf, warm, crusty, and already full of crumbs. As the village wakes up from its celebration fog, the newlyweds do too. But they aren't waking up in solitude. Oh no, their new life begins in the full company of everyone. You peer into the low, timber-framed house they now call home. It's about the size of a large garden shed. 1 room, 1 bed. And 5 other people already moving around, sweeping, chopping, folding, stepping over chickens. So much for privacy. Here in the medieval village, a home is a communal unit. The bride doesn't just move in with her husband. She moves in with his entire family. In-laws, cousins, maybe a grandparent or 2. And not in the guest room because there isn't one. The bed shared space. Often a big wooden frame packed with straw or feathers if you're lucky, and covered in rough linen. You don't sleep there alone. You pile in with others arranged like layers of laundry. Not for warmth of the heart, just literal body heat. It's freezing half the year, and firewood is too precious to waste on snuggling in separate rooms. You glance at the bed and realize this isn't awkward. It's normal. People sleep by necessity, not romance. Kids' parents, married couples, uncles. They all rotate depending on age, status, and whose knees ache the most that week. You sit by the hearth watching the bride try to find a rhythm in the household. She's already helping stir porridge, her wedding garland, wilting a little as smoke curls around her hair. Her new sister-in-law hands her a broom without a word. The message is clear. Welcome to the family, now sweep the dirt under the table like the rest of us. Historians still argue how much autonomy medieval women had in their new homes. Some records show them running households with sharp efficiency. Others hint at daughters-in-law being treated like unpaid interns working constantly under the shadow of their new mother-in-law. Most agree it wasn't easy. But if you earned your place, you earned respect. And sometimes power. The mother-in-law in this household rules the space like a queen with a ladle. She checks everyone's tasks, hands out onions like gold coins, and doesn't blink when a goose walks through the door. You suspect that if the bride wants any peace, she'll need to earn it through boiled stew and respectful silences. There's a sweet moment, though. The groom, half asleep, stumbles into the room with hay in his hair and a stupid grin on his face. He sees his new wife struggling with the broom, takes it from her, and whispers something in her ear that makes her laugh. Not a huge laugh, just enough to tilt her head back. For a second, there's no one else in the room. You catch that second, it matters. Because for all the crowding, the lack of privacy, the too close elbows and shared chamber pots, moments of tenderness still bloomed. Love didn't need a candlelit bath. It just needed a few seconds where the noise faded and 2 people saw each other clearly. Still, you wonder, how does a relationship grow when it's never alone? Answer: it grows in code. A touch on the shoulder while passing. A stolen joke while washing dishes. A shared glance when someone farts too loud at supper. Romance hides in routine. That's the secret of medieval marriage. One of the older kids in the household grumbles about the new wife and how she makes the porridge too runny. Another kid sticks up for her. She just got here stupid. A minor squabble erupts. The mother-in-law bangs her ladle. Peace is restored. You find yourself smiling. This isn't domestic bliss, it's domestic chaos. But it's functioning. Everyone has a role, a rhythm. The new bride is figuring it out, one chore at a time. And chores are endless. Fetching water, feeding animals, mending clothes, scraping ash from the hearth. You watch as the bride follows her mother-in-law to the stream carrying buckets almost her height. She doesn't complain, just adjusts her grip and keeps walking. This is the real honeymoon chores with strangers' blisters on both hands, and maybe, if she's lucky, a husband who brings her a better bucket when the old one leaks. Historians note that rural marriages were often immediately economic. You didn't ease into responsibility. You slammed into it like a cold wave. The wedding was a door swinging open, and behind it 1,000 expectations. But again, you see flashes of humanity. The groom carves something on the doorframe, her name perhaps. He sits beside her at supper even when his brothers tease him. He gives her the last piece of cheese. These small gestures speak louder than any Latin vow. In a world where survival was the main goal, affection wasn't loud. It was consistent, daily, quietly stitched into the background like a patch on a worn tunic. You peek into the hearth again as the bride ladles soup into bowls. She's doing fine, not glowing, not weeping, just learning. You remember the woman at the wedding who said, "It's what comes after that matters." And this is after. No veil, no violins, just turnips, wooden spoons, aching knees, and someone handing you a better blanket when yours gets damp. Maybe this is the best definition of medieval marriage, not a ceremony, but an adjustment. A long, crowded, imperfect process where you find space inside other people's noise. And if you're lucky, someone makes space for you, too. The sun has barely passed its peak, but preparations are underway again. Not for another wedding, but for another medieval curiosity. You weren't expecting the bedding ceremony aftermath. Yes, there's a whole social ritual that picks up after the newlyweds spend their first night together and you're about to get front row seats. The couple emerges from their shared home looking slightly dazed, slightly rumpled, and unmistakably observed. All around them, villagers exchange knowing glances. Some clap, a few wink. One woman even yells, "Still walking straight." Good sign. The bride blushes. The groom scratches his neck and tries to look somewhere, anywhere else. In today's world, the wedding night is usually a private matter. But in the Middle Ages, that privacy was sometimes a luxury people couldn't afford or didn't expect. For many, especially in noble or semi-official settings, the act of bedding was symbolic and communal. If last night was the public ceremony, then today is the social confirmation. But let's rewind a bit. Remember how the couple was escorted to bed. Depending on where and when you are, there could have been music, laughter, suggestive rhymes, even choreographed carrying of the bride over the threshold, usually by the groom, but sometimes by helpful friends if he was too drunk or too short. Once inside, people might have stayed long enough to help them undress. Yes, seriously. Shirts off, shoes off, a kiss on the cheek, and then everyone backs out slowly like they're leaving a museum exhibit. In more extreme versions, friends might ruffle the sheets, leave symbolic items like eggs or herbs for fertility, or brace yourself actually linger to hear a sound. Any sound. Historians still argue how literal these stories are. Some bedding rituals were probably symbolic, and others exaggerated by gossipy chroniclers. But what's clear is that the idea of the communal bed was real, and it didn't always mean what we think it did. For many villagers, the bedding wasn't salacious, it was just a public bookmark. Okay, now they're truly married. Let's get on with the harvest. Back in your current setting, a small group has gathered to sing what sounds like a folk ballad, but with deeply questionable lyrics. You catch a line about plowing fields and milking the cow, and decide not to dig too deep into the metaphors. A basket is passed around containing eggs, bread, and dried herbs gifts for the couple. Practical ones meant to sustain fertility and feed the new household. No one's handing out gold-plated cutlery. The closest thing to a wedding present is a particularly robust potato. You watch as the bride takes a seat beside her new mother-in-law. There's a hush, Then the elder woman announces, "She's a wife now. A good one, we think." Everyone claps. That's the whole ceremony. It's not glamorous. It's not filmed for Instagram. But it carries weight. The public recognition of her new role, not just as a spouse, but as a working cog in the household machine. You hear someone whisper, "Did you check the sheets?" and immediately want to walk into the sea? Turns out in some regions, blood-stained linen was hung out like laundry proof of the bride's virginity. In other places, people were more discreet. But always the obsession with physical evidence remained. And here's the twist: this obsession often had less to do with morality and more to do with property. Virginity wasn't just a spiritual idea, it was a legal concept tied to legitimacy and inheritance. If the bride wasn't pure, then the children's legitimacy might be challenged. And if those children stood to inherit land or status, well, suddenly it was everyone's business what happened under those sheets. You think of the bride again, how young she was, how quiet. Her entire future hanging on what people believe happened last night. That's a lot of pressure for someone who probably hasn't even figured out which cup is hers yet. Still, things aren't all bad. You notice the groom bringing her a bowl of stew without being asked. She nudges his foot under the table. They smile. Maybe they're finding some comfort in each other amidst the chaos. In noble households, this whole process could be even more intense. Imagine dozens of people packed into a candlelit chamber, nobles drinking heavily, making bets about the wedding night's success. One historical account describes a duke's marriage where witnesses literally stayed until the bed creaked. Yikes. Some royal families went even further, recording the entire betting ritual in written contracts, complete with signed confirmations. Imagine your in-laws signing off on your honeymoon. Romantic, no. You sit beside an old man whittling a spoon. He grunts and says, "Wasn't like that in my day. We just got on with it." Then back to work. You ask if he remembers his betting ceremony. He shrugs. "I remember being tired and itchy." Fleas don't care if you're married. Fair point. You scan the crowd again. Now that the ritual's over, the focus shifts. What kind of wife will she be? Can she manage a household? Will she bear strong children? Can she carry 2 buckets without spilling? Her identity isn't just romantic, it's economic. In a way, the betting ceremony acts like a transfer of expectations from maiden to manager. The village now sees her not as a girl, but as a working unit, a role to be filled, a rhythm to join. Still, amid the blunt realities, people do find room for joy. Someone sets off a mini procession with a pig wearing a flower crown. Kids chase it around laughing. The couple sits together in the sun, stealing quiet bites from a shared loaf. There's a strange sweetness here. Maybe it's not about the ritual itself, but the survival that comes after. Because here, in this noisy, nosy, onion-scented village, the question isn't, did the wedding go perfectly, but will you last the winter together? It's later now, edging into the golden haze of afternoon, and you're drawn to the long trestle-style tables creaking under the weight of, well, not much. A few loaves of coarse bread, 2 wheels of slightly worried-looking cheese, a stew pot that smells like every vegetable in the known world was thrown in and argued. A celebrant lifts a jug of ale with a wobble and proclaims, "The feast has begun." You can't help but grin. Because this is the medieval wedding feast. And it's underwhelming, but also absolutely real. Forget roast swans and candied fruit pyramids. That's royal nonsense. Here in the village, the wedding meal is mostly what people can spare, which in a good year might be modestly generous. In a bad one, it's bread broth and maybe a shared onion for flair. Still, people seem cheerful. Someone passes you a bowl of pottage, thick, lumpy, and surprisingly comforting. It tastes like garlic, and something that might have been parsnip in a past life. A woman nearby gestures to a platter of fried dough and says proudly, "Wedding cakes." You nod, not having the heart to point out they look and taste like roof shingles. The couple sits at the head of the table on slightly taller stools. The groom still looks stunned, like he can't believe he's allowed to sit and eat while other people serve him. The bride is halfway through a hunk of cheese, and for the first time she looks relaxed. There's music again. This time, a two-man band, one on a battered lute, the other tapping rhythmically on a barrel. A few people dance. Carefully. No one wants to spill their only cup of ale. Feasting at weddings wasn't just about celebration, it was a display of status. If your family could provide meat, you were doing well. If you had multiple jugs of drinkable ale, you might even get compliments. And if you could hire a musician, you were practically nobility. In many communities, the wedding meal was a way of saying, "Look, we're respectable. Please ignore the hole in our roof." But of course, the feast's size also depended on timing. If the wedding took place after a good harvest, there might be fresh produce, dried fruits, salted fish. If it was held in leaner months, the food might be thin gruel and a little hope. Historians still argue whether feasts were essential or optional for weddings. Some claim they were non-negotiable, a way to publicly announce and legitimize the union. Others say the banquet was often symbolic. A shared crust of bread and a prayer could do the job just fine. You reach for a crusty roll and chew it while watching a boy gnaw an apple so enthusiastically you worry for his teeth. Across the table, an elder is telling a story about a wedding feast from years past, where a duck wandered into the hall and was immediately declared the guest of honor. It eventually became dinner. You try not to think too hard about the roast chicken currently being passed around. A drunk uncle stands up to give a toast. To love, to land, and to strong hips, he bellows. Everyone cheers. You sip your ale, which tastes vaguely like damp twigs, and nod. Sure, why not? Still, there's a darker undercurrent here. Because while people are laughing, there's a tension in the air, one born of memory. You overhear someone mutter, "Better than last year's feast. No frost." Another replies, "Aye, and no coughing yet." They're not just talking about weather, they're talking about survival. Plague, famine, war. These weren't abstract fears. They were regular guests. A bad crop could starve a village. A cold snap could wipe out livestock. Disease could arrive with a single traveler and take 10 people by week's end. And that's why weddings mattered. Not just as social events, but as symbols of life continuing, of resilience, of trying again to build something that would last longer than the next frost. Even if all you had was cabbage soup and hope, a child tugs at your sleeve and offers you a slice of wedding pie. It's beige. You take a bite. It's mostly barley and onion. Somehow, it's not terrible. You ask an older woman if this is typical wedding fare. She shrugs. Some have more, some have less. Depends who dies that month. You blink. She continues. Last summer we buried 4 and married 6. Balanced out. Cheerful, huh? Still, it's not bleak. These people laugh. Loudly. One man is telling a joke about a bishop, a pig, and a thatched roof. It doesn't make sense, but you laugh anyway. A girl with braids is chasing a chicken around a table. The groom's father is trying to explain to someone why his beer is better than everyone else's. He's wrong, but confident. And at the center of it, all the bride and groom. He's sharing his bread with her. She's leaning into his shoulder. You can see it, the small bond already forming. Not fireworks, not a fairy tale. Just a quiet we beginning to grow. You glance again at the food. Nothing fancy, but everything shared. And maybe that's the point. You eat what you have. You give what you can. You celebrate even when the ground beneath your feet is cold and cracked. Because what else can you do? And so the wedding feast rolls on thin stews, thick jokes, flat ale, warm eyes. It's not a banquet for royalty. It's a table full of people who survived long enough to celebrate. And in the Middle Ages, that was feast enough. It's just past dusk now, and the music's picked up again, louder this time, faster. Someone's pulled out a goatskin drum. A girl is clapping rhythmically with a wooden spoon. The groom's younger brother is trying very hard to invent a new dance move that mostly involves hopping in place like a frightened frog. Welcome to the medieval wedding dance. And before you imagine elegant gliding and ballroom grace, let's reset expectations. This isn't Bridgerton. This is barefoot twirling in the dirt, dodging pigs and toddlers while someone tries to remember which way clockwise is. But don't laugh too fast, because medieval dancing came with rules. Strict ones. You step into the dancing ring, a rough circle stamped out in the mud. A line of villagers is performing a slow swaying step that looks deceptively simple. Left-right turn. Left-right twirl. Easy right. Until someone grabs your wrist and snaps too much wrist. You'll start rumors. Ah yes, that rule. See, dancing wasn't just recreation, it was reputation. You weren't just moving your body, you were declaring your character. Step too loosely and people might whisper about your morals. Get too handsy and suddenly you're that person who spoils festivals. There's a reason why the church kept writing stern letters about lewd village caroling. Historians still argue whether dance was seen as innocent or dangerous. Some sources treat it as healthy communal bonding. Others, especially from religious texts, describe it as a gateway to sin and scandal, because where music goes, temptation follows. You twirl again carefully this time and glance around. Most of the dancers are teenagers or young adults. A few elders watch approvingly from benches while toddlers copy movements in chaotic little spirals. It's charming and a little sweaty. The bride is dancing too. She's still wearing her wilted garland, but her face is brighter now, flushed with joy or maybe just exhaustion. Her new husband joins her for a clumsy shuffle that makes half the crowd cheer and the other half wince. Someone throws a handful of flower petals in the air. They land in the stew pot. No one minds. A woman whispers to you that dancing customs vary by region. In some villages, the bride must dance with every eligible bachelor as a farewell to maidenhood. In others, the groom dances only with male relatives to prove he's not soft. You raise an eyebrow at that one. There are partner dances, yes, but also group reels, line formations, and something called threading the needle that ends with people accidentally tying themselves together. Think of it as TikTok challenges 800 years early and with more broken toes. Still, this isn't just about fun. There's structure here. Social placement. Who you dance with and how you dance tells the village everything it needs to know about your status, availability, and sense of rhythm. That's why some people pretend to dance badly to avoid unwanted attention. You spot two older women whispering as a girl spins too energetically. She's angling for attention, one says. The other snorts. She'll get more than that if she keeps flapping like a goose. You notice now that dancing is also how marriages begin, or at least how they're nudged. Pairing up for a few rounds is the medieval equivalent of casually grabbing coffee. If you like the way someone moves, you might find yourself making a late-night walk to the well with them. If not, you just accidentally turn the wrong way in the next round. One of the fiddlers is telling a joke between songs. What do you call a man who can't dance? Married, the crowd groans. Someone throws a crust of bread at him. He bows. Then a new tune begins slower, softer. A circle forms and the bride is led into the middle. This is the bride's dance, a tradition in many parts of medieval Europe. It's her moment. She dances alone or with chosen partners while people drop coins into a cloth held by her family, a symbolic gift for the new household. You watch her step uncertain at first, then smoother. She spins. She catches the rhythm. Her veil twirls like a soft flag. Coins clink into the cloth, mostly copper, a few silver. The last one is a carved button, but the thought counts. The groom joins her for the final turn. They link arms, whirl once, and stumble out of the circle to thunderous applause. Someone calls, "Now kiss her, you donkey," and he blushes so hard his ears go red. But he does, just a quick one, and the crowd goes wild. You sit back on a barrel and take it all in. The music, the laughter, the stomping. Dust rising with every step. There's no chandelier, no DJ, no fog machine. Just humans and rhythm and the need to move together for as long as the fire burns. And maybe that's the real heart of a medieval wedding. Not the feast, not the vows, not even the bed, but the dance. Messy, joyful, awkward, and earnest. Because in a world full of plagues and poor harvests and cold floors, sometimes all you had was the chance to dance and someone who wanted to dance with you. The music fades, the feet slow. Somewhere a lute string snaps with a tragic little twang, and the fiddler announces, "That's me, wrist done." One by one, dancers peel off from the circle, collapsing onto hay bale stools and conveniently placed relatives. The bride is laughing with her sister-in-law, the groom is pouring someone the weakest ale you've ever tasted, and you're wondering what happens after the party ends. And the answer is, you're stuck. Because medieval marriage wasn't just for a season, or until things got rocky, or until someone needed space. It was for life. Full stop. No trial periods, no easy exits. Once those vows were said, those bedsheets wrinkled, and the village had clapped you through your sixth stew, you were bound tighter than a church bell on Easter morning. You listen as two old men nearby debate loudly about goats until one says, "Not as stubborn as my wife. 42 years of marriage and she still hides the salt." They both laugh, but it's the kind of laugh that comes from endurance more than amusement. Because if you were unhappy in a medieval marriage, too bad. You were married. Divorce. That was a legal miracle, rare, complicated, and mostly reserved for the elite. For everyone else, your options were suffer quietly, complain loudly and get side-eyed by your neighbors, or pray your spouse died of dysentery. You think that's a joke, but it's not. The church took marriage seriously. As in sacrament of God, indissoluble, get used to each other levels of serious. Once two people freely consented and consummated, that was it. The union was sealed, not just socially, but spiritually. And this permanence came with pressure, because you weren't just committing to a person, you were committing to decades of their flaws. His bad back, her weird obsession with eels, his tendency to lose the goat every Wednesday, her total inability to make porridge without burning it, and all of it forever. You overhear a woman muttering about her husband snoring. She says it sounds like a dying bellows stuffed with frogs. Another sighs. At least yours doesn't talk in his sleep about turnip prices. Love clearly was not required. In fact, many medieval marriages began with no love at all. They were practical matches arranged by families secured through land or livestock and expected to grow into something tolerable. If affection bloomed, great. If not, keep stirring the stew and try not to make eye contact. Still, affection could grow. Some couples did build warm, respectful bonds. You can see it in the way the groom just handed his bride a seat and tucked a blanket over her knees. There's no grand gesture, just a quiet sense of shared life. But for those who weren't so lucky, the road was long and full of friction. Historians still argue how many medieval couples were genuinely unhappy. The records we have are skewed, focused on elite drama court cases or unusually spicy chronicles. The silent majority likely did what they always did, endured, adjusted, grumbled, a little laughed, a little raised kids, and hoped for decent weather. You ask someone if separation was ever allowed. She frowns, then nods. Sometimes she says, if he beats her too much, or runs off. But even then, she's still his. And that's the kicker. You could separate under certain circumstances, violence, abandonment, heresy. But you couldn't remarry. You were still tied to the first spouse unless the church officially annulled the union. And annulments expensive, rare, and tangled in red tape. Even noble women with money and status found divorce nearly impossible. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine. Her first marriage to King Louis VII was annulled after 15 years because it was supposedly unconsummated. Sure, Eleanor. Sure. You walk through the village now noticing how many older couples live in silence. Not cold silence necessarily, just the kind worn thin by time. They've said all the words. Now it's down to glances, gestures, and occasional bursts of swearing. You pass a man carving a wooden spoon while his wife knits beside him. They don't speak, but their feet are touching. And somehow that says everything. Still, there were moments when people did try to escape. One woman in 14th century England claimed her husband was possessed by demons. Another accused hers of being too fond of the sheep. A man tried to annul his marriage on the grounds that his wife had bad breath. It didn't work. The courts were skeptical. Unless you had proof, and sometimes even if you did, you were told to reconcile, which meant go home, try again, and don't cause a scene. So you had to be creative. You hear tales tonight of a woman who accidentally dropped a beehive in her husband's bed. Another who kept moving the fence posts until he fell into a ditch. Petty, sure. Effective, debatable. Satisfying, absolutely. But many just endured. You worked together, raised children, shared food, managed chores. And if you got a kind word once a week, that was enough. Because marriage wasn't about romance, it was about function. And oddly enough, in that function, people sometimes found connection. Through routine, through shared hardship, through winter after winter of mending and coughing and holding hands beneath the table when no one was looking. You sit back near the fire watching the bride now resting her head on the groom's shoulder. He's half asleep, drooling slightly, but she doesn't seem to mind. They're not in love, maybe. Not yet. But they're married. And in this world that's both a sentence and a promise. You awake mentally anyway to the soft scraping of a broom on packed earth. Morning light pours through the crooked shutters of the groom's family cottage, catching on floating specks of dust and someone's sock, which has mysteriously landed on the rafter again. The newlyweds are up. Of course they are. There's no sleeping in when your in-laws live 3 feet away and someone's already asking where the good ladle went. But there's something different about today. The bride is now part of the household. Officially. Irrevocably. And from this point forward, she's got 2 jobs, work and survival. Yet for some brides, the real work doesn't begin at marriage. It begins at widowhood. You hear the clanging of a pot outside, followed by a chorus of laughter. Turns out someone's great-aunt is telling a story about the widow Greta, a legend in these parts. Married at 13, widowed at 17, remarried by 21, and running her own alehouse by 23. Tough as boiled leather, the aunt declares proudly. And this brings you into one of the most fascinating, rarely romantic, often terrifying chapters of medieval marriage. What happens when the husband dies? You might think widowhood brought freedom, and sometimes it did. But more often, it was a scramble emotionally, legally, and financially. In many medieval communities, especially among peasants, a widow was expected to remarry fast, as in before the next harvest, if possible. A single woman without male protection was seen as vulnerable, not just socially, but economically. She couldn't own much property outright. She couldn't easily defend herself in court. And she definitely couldn't plow a field alone. So you imagine waking up after your husband's funeral only to have someone's uncle say, "Well, now let's see who's available, shall we?" Romantic. Historians still argue whether widows had more power than we think. Some documents show widows running households, managing land, even lending money. Others show them caught in endless legal webs trying to recover dower rights, a portion of the husband's property promised to support her, while male relatives circled like buzzards. In some towns, a widow could claim free bench a right to remain on her husband's land if she stayed chaste. The local court might check this with an oath. And yes, occasionally, neighbors would testify about whether the widow had visitors. You're not sure whether to laugh or shudder, but there was prestige too. A widow who survived long enough and smartly enough could become a matriarch. The quiet power behind generations. No longer subject to her father or husband, she could finally make choices. Assuming, of course, that life hadn't already made too many for her. You sit beside a group of older women peeling root vegetables. One says, "I was widowed twice. The first left me a pig. The second left me peace." The others nod. No one laughs. That's the thing. Marriage might have been about survival, but widowhood was survival on hard mode. If you were lucky, your late husband left behind a son old enough to work the land. If not, you might rely on brothers, cousins, even in-laws, who suddenly found reasons to borrow your tools permanently. Still, a few widows thrived. You hear about a merchant's widow who took over his textile trade and became so powerful that men refused to haggle with her. Too sharp, they said. Smiles like a cat that's already eaten. In noble households, things got even trickier. Widows of lords or knights might become pawns again, remarried off to secure alliances or keep estates intact. Some were sent to nunneries. Others chose the veil-escaping marriage entirely for the safety and structure of the convent. Of course, that wasn't always peaceful either. One nun you hear about allegedly ran a side business selling honeymead. When questioned, she replied, "The Lord helps those who ferment." Back in the village, the bride you've been following is watching her new mother-in-law herself, a widow, direct the cooking like a battle general. She doesn't speak much. She just points, and things happen. It's clear she runs this house, has for years. And now she's watching her new daughter-in-law with sharp eyes deciding whether she's worthy. You suspect she is. The girls learned quickly. She listens more than she talks. She knows when to speak and when to stir. Still, the thought hangs in the air. What if the groom dies? Accidents are common. War looms in the distance. Even a bad winter cough can take a man down. The bride might find herself a widow before she turns 20. And then what? Marry again, serve again, try again, or just maybe stand her ground. Like Widow Greta, like the alehouse owner, like the quiet woman 2 doors down who never remarried and raises chickens like they owe her money. You ask someone nearby if widowhood is considered unlucky. The answer surprises you. No, they say. It's considered earned. And then only the strong become widows. The weak die first. That hangs with you, because as brutal as medieval marriage could be, widowhood was its own battlefield. But in it, some women found strength, voice, even freedom. It wasn't the path they chose, but sometimes it was the one that finally led to selfhood. You've barely finished your morning barley porridge, Chunky, with a surprise turnip when the village begins to stir again. Not for another wedding, not even a funeral this time, but for something far more elaborate, a noble procession. Word spreads fast. A wedding among the lords. And everyone's going to watch, even if it means standing in sheep dung for half the day. You follow the crowd up a gentle hill, where a grander house stands stone, not wood, with glass windows even. There's a decorative arch at the gate. A woman is sweeping petals off the steps and muttering about overpaid poets. A servant pushes you back gently. "Commoners to the side, please." Ah, yes. You've entered the upper tier of matrimony, the noble wedding. And it is different. The bride arrives by cart, not the open kind that usually carries turnips, but a covered litter draped in silk and bright with family colors. She's maybe 15, pale as linen with hair braided so tight, you wonder if blinking hurts. Her dress is in embroidered miracle gold threads, imported dyes sleeves wide enough to smuggle a goose in, and around her neck, jewels. Real ones. Next to her, the groom waits stiffly. He's older, late 20s maybe, with polished boots and a sword that looks like it's never been used. He doesn't look at her. He looks at the notary, because here in the noble world, love has even less to do with it. You see the papers laid out a series of contracts, property exchanges, dowry confirmations, alliance terms. This wedding is less about two people and more about two houses. Entire acres of land are being bundled together like party favors. Historians still debate how much control noble brides had over these arrangements. In some cases, noble women wrote letters expressing desires or displeasure, but in most, they were pawns, diplomats in silk, walking treaties. You glance again at the bride. Her hands are trembling just slightly. A lady's maid notices and whispers something that makes her straighten her spine. The performance begins. The ceremony is in Latin. A priest drones the words. Vows are exchanged like business transactions. The groom offers a token, a ring this time, while someone reads aloud the land titles being exchanged. 2 vineyards, 1 mill, and grazing rights in the southern field. The bride nods politely. You doubt she's ever seen the field. After the formalities, the couple is led inside not to celebrate, but to seal the deal. And yes, just like in peasant circles, noble marriages often required public betting. But this time, it's witnessed by other nobles, sometimes even royalty. They don't stay for the whole performance, thankfully, but they do wait long enough to make sure the couple's in the bed under the sheets, and at least trying. One account you overhear involves a courtier who had to stand by while the royal couple lay still under ceremonial cloth. Like watching bread rise, he mutters. You wonder how the bride feels, but you already know it doesn't matter. She's performed well. The documents are signed. The titles exchanged. She's now property with property. And yet some of these unions did grow into something functional, even affectionate. If the couple was close in age or shared interests, falconry, maybe embroidery, resenting their families, they might carve out companionship. But make no mistake, the foundation was politics. You ask a servant how long the couple has known each other. She says, they met yesterday. Then adds, better than some. At least he's not a cousin twice over. The power dynamics here are dizzying. You see the bride's father, tight-lipped eyes scanning the crowd, clearly calculating. He's just elevated his family's position by tying his daughter to a wealthier lord. Her happiness, optional. Her loyalty, expected. You hear about another noble wedding last year where the bride was 9 and the groom 32. They waited 3 years before consummation. So thoughtful. Meanwhile, the girl spent her time in a foreign court, learning which fork to use and how not to cry in public. Even among royals, things could get dicey. Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII, was married at 12 and pregnant by 13. She barely survived childbirth, her husband dead within a year. She never remarried. Possibly by choice, possibly by sheer exhaustion. Still not every noble marriage was bleak. There are letters from some lords to their wives, sweet, worried, even poetic. One baron wrote to his wife during battle asking her to remind the cook not to oversalt the stew. Romance, maybe, or just indigestion avoidance. You're pulled back to the present by a cheer. The couple emerges from the manor. They wave stiffly. The crowd applauds mostly because they've been promised bread and ale after. Nobles know how to keep peasants happy snacks and spectacle. The bride now wears a crown of pearls. The groom holds her arm like he's not entirely sure what to do with it. Together they walk down a carpet of crushed petals and into a lifetime of court obligations, seasonal relocations, and dinner conversations about tax levies. You catch her eye for a moment. She doesn't smile, but she nods once slowly, as if to say, yes, I know. This is not a wedding. This is a merger. And you realize something. In peasant weddings, the stakes are survival. In noble weddings, the stakes are power. But in both, the bride rarely chooses. And in both, everyone watches, hoping, fearing, judging. Because marriage in this world is never just between two people. It's between families, fates, fields, and futures. And the vows, they're just the opening bid. The noble wedding is winding down well for the guests anyway. For the couple, the real business is just beginning. After the feasting, the dancing, and the tense exchange of titles, what's left is a strange and highly uncomfortable ritual known to court watchers and castle servants alike, the morning after. But don't worry, you're not going back into that bedchamber. Instead, you follow the crowd of nobles as they prepare for the next ceremonial event, the public betting report. Yes, in case there was any ambiguity, the entire household is eager to confirm that the union has been properly, shall we say, ratified. You stand near the edge of the great hall as a steward unrolls a scroll and announces in a voice far too loud that the marriage between Lord Edmund and Lady Isolde has been honorably and lawfully consummated. No one claps, but there are satisfied nods. One guest whispers, "Thank heavens. Last year's bride fainted and they had to wait a week." In some regions, especially among royalty, the morning after included the dramatic production of stained bed sheets. You hear an elderly noblewoman say she once saw such linens paraded through the banquet hall like a victorious battle standard. You really, really hope that's apocryphal. And yet there's a strange logic to it. In noble society, children were currency. Marriages weren't sealed with love. They were sealed with heirs. No heirs, no alliance. No alliance, political instability. So verifying consummation wasn't just nosy, it was necessary. If the bride didn't conceive within a year or two, whispers would start. Was the husband impotent? Was the bride cursed? Were there too many bad omens on the wedding day? You hear someone blame a failed royal union on a crow crying thrice during the blessing. Because obviously, historians still argue how seriously these rituals were taken. Some believe the morning after inspections were symbolic. Others think they were very real, very invasive, and sometimes recorded in writing for legal reasons. In at least one 14th century French case, the king himself appointed a committee to investigate whether a marriage had been properly consummated. A committee. Meanwhile, the newlywed noblewoman Lady Isolde is being congratulated by older women, some of whom haven't smiled since the last harvest. One pats her hand and says, "You did your duty." Isolde nods, expression blank. Maybe tired. Maybe just bracing herself for the next 20 years of duty. And the husband, Lord Edmund, is bragging about the size of his hawk. Not a euphemism, an actual falcon. He seems much more relaxed now that he's officially produced results. You move outside hoping for air and fewer euphemisms. Instead, you find yourself near the stables where the servants are gossiping freely. One girl says she heard the new bride sobbing. Another says she smiled after. A third shrugs. Either way, it's done. This bluntness is jarring, but honest. Because noble women didn't often get second chances. Their future depended on what happened behind that curtain. Fail to please your husband, he might send you home. Fail to produce a child, he might seek an annulment. In fact, many annulment cases in noble Europe revolved around non-consummation, or, more precisely, alleged non-consummation. It was one of the few accepted reasons to break a marriage, particularly if a better match came along. If the bride could prove the marriage was never completed, she might get her freedom, or at least be sent quietly to a nunnery. And this wasn't always tragic. Some noble women preferred the convent life. More autonomy, more books, fewer surprise pregnancy deaths. You walk now through the inner court of the manor, where painted frescoes tell stories of noble weddings past. One depicts a bride holding a sword instead of a bouquet. You ask someone about it. They laugh. "Oh, that's Lady Alienor. She refused to marry unless she could challenge her suitor to a duel first." Did she win? No, but she married him anyway. Said he fought decently enough. Not all noblewomen were passive pawns. Some played the game, expertly. Letters survive from duchesses manipulating matches, managing estates, even arranging second marriages for their daughters based entirely on the military strength of the neighboring barony. You hear about a countess who was widowed twice and used both inheritances to fund the construction of a church and a private library. Her second husband had reportedly died from excessive riding. You decide not to ask follow-up questions. Back in the Great Hall, the couple now sits side by side receiving formal blessings. Not from a priest this time, but from a notary, a steward and a family representative bearing a bundle of wheat and a live goose. For fertility, he explains. The goose honks once and promptly relieves itself on the floor. A fitting symbol, really. You wonder what Isolde is thinking. If she's imagining a quiet garden to walk in, or planning her future children's names, or counting the jewels in her dowry and thinking about what she could trade for a good book. The truth is, we'll never really know. The voices of noblewomen, especially new brides, are often absent from the records. What survives are contracts, titles, inheritance lists, occasionally a desperate letter, but more often they vanish into the background of their own weddings. You head back to the village as the noble couple disappears behind the manor walls. It's quieter here. No embroidered banners, no ceremonial geese. Just people tilling fields, repairing carts, and preparing for their own smaller ceremonies. And suddenly, the chaos of the peasant wedding with its mud, its awkward stew, its grumpy dancing feels comforting, honest. At least the bride there got to taste the soup before being handed a sword-shaped life plan. Because while noble weddings may be grand, they're rarely kind. And while they might be sealed with gold, they're also stamped with silence. The next morning, you're back in the village, shaking straw out of your tunic and wondering if you dreamt the whole noble wedding. But before you can settle into any leftover bread or contemplate how to sneak more turnips into your pouch, something stirs near the road, a caravan, and at the front, a young woman in an embroidered cloak flanked by men with swords, servants carrying chests, and one very angry chicken stuffed in a basket. Her face is blank, her eyes exhausted. She's a foreign bride. Today you're witnessing another kind of wedding entirely, one that bridges not just households or villages, but entire regions, kingdoms, or empires. These marriages aren't just inconvenient, they're relocations. Culture shock with a dowry attached. Sometimes language shock too. You watch the procession roll into the village square where her new husband's household is waiting to greet her. She's come from a coastal region, her new home inland farmland. Different food, different clothes, different customs. And she's supposed to pretend none of that matters. A man steps forward, older stiff, in ceremonial armor. The groom. He nods at her. She nods back. No words are exchanged. They probably don't even speak the same language. A translator steps in, offering quick summaries like, he says welcome and she says thank you, though you suspect the actual dialogue is more complicated. These kinds of marriages weren't just noble, plenty of middling households did it too, especially merchants or landowners seeking new alliances. But among the elite, it was standard practice. Daughters were traded like political chips shipped across Europe and beyond to form bonds between kingdoms, settle disputes, or cement treaties. And these women, they were expected to adapt instantly. Historians still debate how these women coped. Some embraced their new homes. Others struggled for years writing desperate letters home, requesting foods, clothes, even familiar salt. One German princess married into an English household and was so horrified by the food she swore she'd live on apples alone. You imagine this girl half a continent away from her cousins sleeping under a roof made from unfamiliar wood and surrounded by servants who whisper every time she mispronounces a name. How do you even start to belong? The answer very carefully. You walk past the welcome feast now being arranged in her honor. Local dishes she won't recognize. Bread shaped differently. Meat spiced the wrong way. A local elder is loudly explaining what blood pudding is, while a young girl offers her a cup of mead that smells like regret. The bride thanks them graciously, then doesn't drink it. And now comes the gift exchange. In foreign marriages, gifts were crucial. They weren't just for show, they were political tools. The bride might arrive with embroidered cloth, rare spices, exotic birds, even medical books from faraway lands. In return, she's given land-right servants and the promise, always the promise of protection. You hear about one Byzantine princess who arrived in France with a troupe of musicians and her own bathwater. People were bewildered. But by week 2, the locals were trying to copy her hairstyle. Because here's the twist, foreign brides were often seen as trendsetters. Outsiders, yes, but also exotic, powerful, mysterious. And the more awkward their accent, the more likely someone would write a poem about it. You walk with the procession into the manor's main hall. The groom is presenting his new bride with a house key. Not symbolically, literally. He's handing her a giant iron key as a way of saying, "This is your domain now." She nods and slips it into her belt where it clangs awkwardly against the hilt of a dagger she probably doesn't know how to use. You ask someone nearby how long it usually takes for foreign brides to settle. The answer: it depends. Some never do. Others learn the herbs by spring. You don't push further. Language remains the biggest barrier. Until she learns the local tongue, this bride will rely on intermediaries, servants, tutors, friendly in-laws, if she's lucky. Misunderstandings are inevitable. One tale tells of a bride who mistook a family prayer circle for a duel challenge and brandished a spoon. But some foreign brides wield their outsider status like a blade. You hear stories of women who transformed their husband's court, introducing new fashion, new songs, new laws. One Sicilian noblewoman became so politically savvy that she negotiated trade deals better than her husband ever could. When he died, she ruled for another 15 years. Still, the adjustment is brutal. Tonight, the bride will sleep in a room filled with foreign voices, foreign scents, foreign worries. The man beside her is still a stranger. The fire burns differently. The sheets scratch differently. Even the stars seem slightly out of place. You think of her mother wherever she is, wondering if her daughter made it safely. She did. But safe doesn't mean at peace. Historians point to letters, fragile parchment records of these women's inner lives. One pleads for cinnamon. Another asks if her baby should be swaddled the way they do back home. A third simply says, "I miss the river." You glance back at today's bride. She's no longer looking lost. She's standing quietly near the hearth, one hand on the key at her hip. She's not crying. She's just recalibrating. Because in a medieval world that never asked her what she wanted, she's already doing the most remarkable thing of all. She's enduring. Night has fallen again, and just as you think things might finally slow down, someone rushes through the village gates in a panic. Not for a fire, not for a lost cow, but because someone broke a wedding taboo. Apparently, the bride tripped over a broom on her way into the house, and now 3 old women are clutching their aprons and muttering in Latin-inflected warnings. A black cat was spotted during the dancing. Someone dropped a knife. Worse, the groom put his left shoe on first. You're starting to realize something. In medieval weddings, it's not just about love or duty or inheritance. It's also about luck. Or more specifically, avoiding bad luck. Because if you mess this up, the universe, or the saints, or the ghosts of your ancestors, might just decide your marriage is cursed from day one. Superstition weaves through every part of medieval life like a suspiciously knotted thread. And weddings prime ground for it. After all, you're inviting chaos. 2 families, 1 household, many expectations. So naturally, people reach for meaning wherever they can find it, in omens, in patterns, in rituals barely remembered but deeply obeyed. A woman nearby insists the bride should have worn her shift inside out to ward off evil spirits. Another says someone should have salted the threshold. A third whispers that the priest didn't use the right candle. You ask what would have happened if they hadn't seen the cat. The answer: it might have gone smoothly. And then, how would we know what to blame when the cow dies? Superstitions were surprisingly consistent across regions. Don't marry during Lent. Don't get married on a Friday, it's unlucky. Wednesdays are better. Unless it's raining. Then wait. Unless you can't. Then at least kill a chicken and check its liver. Yes, really. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were taken seriously or just half-joking traditions. But either way, people obeyed them. Because in a world ruled by plague, famine, and lightning that struck randomly, why risk it? One elderly man says his sister's wedding cake fell, and within a year her husband was eaten by wolves. Everyone nods solemnly. No one questions whether wolves even live near here. And it's not just what you do during the wedding, it's what you don't do. You don't sew your wedding dress on a Sunday. You don't wear green unless you're Irish nobility or trying to get cursed. You definitely don't see the groom before the ceremony, unless you already live together. In which case, ignore that part and throw salt over your shoulder. You pass a doorway now where someone's hung garlic and a small pouch filled with, is that hair? Yes. Human hair. Bride's first combing, the woman explains. Keeps her from losing her wits. You nod like this makes complete sense. The fear isn't just about ghosts or demons. It's about failure. If the marriage breaks down, someone will point to that cracked cup from the feast, or the way the groom sneezed during the vows, or the knife that fell blade up. Even names could be unlucky. If your names shared the same starting letter, bad sign. If your mother's name was the same as your husband's first love, terrible omen. If your names made a bad rhyme, someone might recite it at the feast and you were doomed. You ask someone how much they believe in all this. She shrugs. A little. Just enough. Then adds, better safe than widowed. But it's not all dark. Some superstitions bless the couple. A spider on the bride's gown. Good fortune. A dog howling during the ceremony. A sign of loyalty. A drunken uncle falling into the river. That one's debated. You hear about one village where it's tradition to toss walnuts at the couple as they leave the feast. Why walnuts? No one remembers, they say. But the year we skipped it, there was a fire. And now, no one skips it. You return to the central hearth where the bride and groom are playing along with the rituals. She lets an old woman rub ash on her forehead for protection. He ties a red string around his wrist and pretends not to look nervous. They're not superstitious, maybe, but they're medieval. And that means understanding that invisible things matter just as much as visible ones. A cracked jug, a shadow on the wall, a bird that lands where it shouldn't. These are messages, warnings, instructions, or if nothing else, excuses for when things go wrong. One man tells a story about how his wedding was nearly ruined because someone dropped a mirror. 7 years bad luck, he says. But I married her anyway. Then with a crooked smile, we made it 6. Laughter, shrugs, a toast. You sit back and think maybe superstition is just the language people use to describe chaos. When life is unpredictable rules, any rules offer comfort, especially when they rhyme. And so with a handful of salt, a red ribbon, a sheep's glance, and a pie that didn't crack, the marriage continues. Not blessed by logic, not protected by law, but maybe guarded by garlic and good timing. You wake with the rooster, though frankly it was more of a squawk than a crow. The sun spills through gaps in the shutter, and across the square, you spot the bride stepping outside her new home with a bundle under her arm. A dress. Or at least, something pretending to be one. Today she wears her best apron. That's because in most medieval weddings, especially among the lower classes, bridal fashion was let's say, interpretive. There were no designer gowns, no tool explosions, no glittering tiaras unless you were nobility. And even then, the tiara probably doubled as a defensive weapon. You inch closer, watching her shake out the garment. It's clean, probably the cleanest thing she owns. A coarse woolen shift dyed a soft brown from walnut husks or onion skins, and an apron that has clearly been re-hemmed half a dozen times. A splash of color at the neckline, a small brooch made of bone and tin. This is the medieval equivalent of haute couture. Unlike modern weddings, there wasn't a standard bridal look. The idea of wearing white didn't become a trend until Queen Victoria wore it in 1840. Before that, you wore what you had. If you had access to blue, a rare and costly dye, you might wear that. Blue was associated with purity, and the Virgin Mary, though ironically mud stains showed up even better on it. You pass a woman spinning yarn who scoffs. She's lucky her shift doesn't itch. Then sotto voce mine felt like it was made of hedgehog. The older women gather around the bride, now straightening her hem, pinning her hair back with long wooden needles. No mirrors, just judgment. One adjusts the shoulder seam and says, "Better. You don't want to look like you're about to milk a goat." And then, of course, comes the veil, or what passes for one. For most peasant brides, it's a linen cloth, or wool wrap, sometimes embroidered if the family could afford it. It covers the hair, which is the real symbol here. A woman's loose hair in medieval Europe was associated with virginity and youth. Married women were expected to keep it braided or veiled. No flowing curls. No flower crowns unless it was very regional and very seasonal. The bride wears hers simply braided tightly with 2 pins holding it flat. Someone tucks a sprig of rosemary behind her ear. For remembrance, they say. Someone else mutters, for fertility. You hope she doesn't get the two confused. Historians still argue how much emphasis was placed on wedding attire. Some sources suggest rural folk cared little, focusing instead on the feast or the dowry. Others claim great effort went into making sure the bride looked elevated, not elegant, but respectable, dignified, like she could churn butter and still impress a bishop. And then there are the accessories. One woman is braiding dried flowers into the bride's belt. Another adds a necklace of woven thread and beads made from dyed beans. No gold, no pearls, just craftsmanship, patience, and symbolism. You glance over to the men. The groom's tunic has been hastily brushed with straw. He's wearing a cleanish belt and a new pair of socks. One of them has his and hers stitched into the cuffs, most likely a joke from his brother. You resist the urge to clap. Noble weddings were different, of course. The fashion there was an event. Dresses with sleeves longer than your arms, cloaks lined with fur, gowns imported from Burgundy or Italy if you were lucky. And yes, sometimes they were white, but only if that happened to be in style, or if your family had a terrifyingly good bleach recipe. Royal brides were expected to show wealth in every stitch. Gold thread, jewels sewn into hems, brocade layered like architectural shingles. You'd be sweating before you reached the altar. Back here in the village, no one sweats because of fashion. They sweat because someone keeps throwing logs on the fire, and the stew smells like boiled turnip panic. The bride steps back to look at herself in the polished metal plate someone's holding. It's not a mirror exactly, just a warped reflection. But it'll do. She nods just once, and with that, she's ready. Or as ready as anyone gets when they're wearing a dress sewn by their mother, adjusted by their aunt, and quietly criticized by 3 goats. You're pulled aside by a young girl who whispers, she's wearing her dead sister's shoes. You blink. She continues. They say it brings double fertility. You ask how the sister died. The girl shrugs. Shoe-related, maybe. Fashion in the Middle Ages wasn't just about looks. It was about meaning. Every choice, real or accidental, carried interpretation. Embroidery might indicate your region. A sash could symbolize your family's status. A slightly longer hem might be read as pride, or laziness, or pregnancy. Speaking of which, you hear whispers now from the women again. She's walking carefully. That's not her usual apron. She's been looking pale since Easter. You realize they're not talking about fashion anymore. They're talking about pregnancy. Because here's the uncomfortable truth: many medieval brides were already pregnant on their wedding day. In some places, this was scandalous. In others, it was strategic. Proof of fertility that could accelerate marriage negotiations. After all, no one wants to marry a barren bride. So clothing in that sense becomes a disguise, a veil, literally and figuratively, to cover, to protect, to delay judgment. You glance back at her. She's standing still now, hands folded, eyes forward, cloaked in linen symbolism and the sharp awareness that every wrinkle will be remembered. And in this world, what you wear might just matter as much as what you vow. The air today feels heavier, not stormy, just dense with whispers, the kind of tension that bubbles just under the surface of everyone's polite smiles. Because this afternoon, someone let it slip the bride might already be pregnant. And just like that, you've stumbled into the not-so-secret, utterly common, mildly scandalous world of premarital pregnancy in medieval marriages. You're probably expecting shame, shunning, some dramatic nun fainting into her rosary. But no, the truth is far more practical and in some places even encouraging. Because here in this village, a visibly fertile bride isn't always a liability. She's a guarantee. You sit by the well as two old women exchange theories with the ease of seasoned gossip generals. Well, she's been glowing since Candlemas. She's always glowed, you bet. She avoided pickled onions last week. That's a sign. She's allergic to pickled onions. You try not to laugh, but honestly, it's impressive how swiftly the evidence piles up. A shift worn loose, a skipped dance, a brief hand over the belly during the stew round. It's not unusual. In many medieval communities, a premarital pregnancy wasn't a shocking scandal. It was more like a fast-track pass to a wedding. If two people were already, shall we say, involved, and a pregnancy appeared, the church and community often insisted they marry immediately, and then pretended that the baby arrived a bit early. Historians still argue just how tolerant medieval society was about this. Church law forbade sex before marriage, but in practice, many betrothed couples treated the engagement as a kind of soft launch. You hear about couples who were handfasted for a year living together unofficially, often consummating, then formalizing the union once a child was on the way. One man near the bread oven says proudly, "I married her 6 days before my son was born. He was just enthusiastic." No one bats an eye. In rural life, results mattered more than timelines. A healthy baby meant a healthy future. If a couple proved fertility beforehand, it was reassurance, especially when infant mortality was so high and sterile unions could doom an entire family's prospects. But let's not romanticize too much. There was judgment, especially if the pregnancy was visible and the wedding hadn't happened yet. A girl who got into trouble without a marriage lined up faced real consequences, social, legal, even spiritual. Her options limited. Her child, possibly labeled illegitimate, which mattered a lot if there was property or inheritance at stake. You hear of one young woman who gave birth in the woods alone, then re-entered the village pretending the baby had been delivered by saints. No one believed her, but they baptized the baby anyway. Sometimes the church got involved, insisting the couple marry, issuing public penance, or assigning the bride to a period of correctional silence, which sounds like a really passive-aggressive punishment involving long embroidery projects and no stew. Still, the line was blurry. You hear about couples who rushed the wedding once the belly began to round. Suddenly, feast plans were cut short. The priest was available at odd hours. And "why are we marrying during a hailstorm" was met with, "because now is better than later." It wasn't always sad, though. One young woman you pass is giggling with her sister. She's getting what she wanted, the sister says. He always said he'd marry her someday. The baby just hurried him along. Then she adds, and he's cute. The father, I mean. The baby will hopefully take after him. There's laughter, not shame, because in villages like this, where community memory is long but conveniently selective, timing can be massaged. The baby came early, they'll say. He was a fast one. She carried small. It was the turnip stew that did it. You glance at the bride now. She's not hiding. She's shelling peas with her new sister-in-law and humming a song about geese that makes no sense. Her hands are steady. Her shoulders relaxed. If she is pregnant, she seems oddly at peace. And maybe that's the point. In a world where life expectancy is short, every marriage carries urgency. The faster you produce, the better. Some regions even treated premarital conception as a sort of trial proof of compatibility. If you can farm together and reproduce together well, bonus points. Among nobility, it was a bit more dangerous. A visibly pregnant noble bride could raise suspicions of infidelity, especially if the marriage was meant to seal alliances. In such cases, there were sometimes virginity tests, grim, invasive, often unreliable, and occasionally dramatic annulments based on moral impurity. But even then, if the groom didn't object, and the baby looked politically convenient, people often looked the other way. You hear about a royal bride who gave birth 6 months after her wedding. When someone asked how that was possible, the king's physician shrugged and said, "Some women are just quick." Back here, no one's measuring trimesters. They're measuring trust. Has the bride proven herself loyal, kind, willing to work? If the answer is yes, and she seems healthy, then no one's counting calendar days. The only thing that really matters is whether the child survives. And so as the evening draws near, someone leaves a small carved toy by the bride's door. Not addressed, just placed. A quiet wish, a symbol of hope or acceptance. Because in this village, a bump before vows is less of a scandal and more of a signal. Life has already begun. It's late again, but sleep is clearly off the table. There's shouting near the square. A lute just snapped mid-chord. Someone is missing a shoe. And over by the ox cart, a pig is screaming like it's being read the book of Revelation. Congratulations, you've made it to the part of the wedding nobody talks about in storybooks when things go completely off the rails. Tonight, the wedding has transformed from ceremony to chaos. And you're about to discover that in medieval times, when a celebration hit its 3rd or 4th mug of ale, it didn't gently wind down, it escalated. You duck as a cabbage flies past your head. Because yes, medieval weddings sometimes ended in brawls, arrests, or full-on livestock-related incidents. It starts innocently enough. A drinking contest. A boast from the groom's cousin about kissing all the bridesmaids. A poorly aimed juggling attempt with eggs. And then, someone insults someone's bread. Or sister. Or turnip yield. And suddenly, it's medieval fight night. You edge toward the action. One man is trying to climb a wagon while holding a duck. Another is standing on a barrel loudly reciting poetry that sounds suspiciously like insults. Someone just challenged a child to a foot race. Barefoot. In the mud. Historians confirm medieval weddings were notoriously rowdy. What started as a sacred union often turned into a test of endurance. Drinking, dancing, storytelling, games, all fine in moderation. But moderation rarely survived past the 2nd round of hot mead and wedding stew surprise. You hear the bride's aunt shout, "Who gave the drummer more ale? He's playing like his trousers are on fire." Someone checks. They are. In some regions, these celebrations lasted for days, literally. 3, sometimes even 7 full days of feasting, dancing, and general pandemonium. Long enough for guests to fall in love, fall asleep in the hayloft, or fall into the river. Often in that order. There's a tale circulating tonight about a wedding last year where the groom ended the night unconscious in a goose pen. The bride carried him home. Romantic, someone says. Very poultry forward. You wonder how people survived these events. The answer, not always gracefully. You overhear a conversation between two elders about a time when the priest got so drunk he tried to marry the bride to a butter churn. Apparently, no one noticed for 3 hours. Then there are the games. Oh, the games. You watch a group of boys trying to pin a ribbon on a pig. This is not a euphemism. The pig naturally is not participating willingly. It charges through the crowd, knocks over a bench, and causes a domino effect that ends with 2 cousins falling into the stew pot. Everyone cheers. Elsewhere, a bride's cousin is challenging people to wrestle like in the old stories. He's already sprained 1 ankle and lost a tooth. Still, the line to fight him is 5 people long. But not all the chaos is uninvited. You hear a story about charivari, a folk tradition in some parts of medieval Europe, where a newlywed couple, particularly if the match was controversial, would be subjected to an impromptu parade of noisy, mocking neighbors. Pots banged, songs sung badly, fake advice shouted through the windows. It was part prank, part punishment, part very confusing community theater. Historians still debate whether charivari was more about teasing or controlling. Some argue it was a form of social cohesion reminding everyone of the community's watchful eye. Others think it was just an excuse to be loud. You lean toward the latter as someone starts drumming on a bucket with a ladle and chanting, "Don't trust the goose." You spot the bride now perched on a bench with a half-empty cup and a weary smile. She looks content, not overwhelmed, just resigned to the fact that yes, someone is currently chasing a goat through her new backyard with a candle. And the groom, he's missing 1 shoe, 2 buttons, and most of his dignity. He's being applauded for falling into the flower trough with great style. You're not sure how to interpret that. Still, there's something joyful here. Strange, excessive sticky, but joyful. Because in a world where so much was governed by rules, ritual, and religious authority, the wedding celebration was one of the rare spaces where play was allowed, encouraged even. You worked hard all year. You endured storms, sickness, and sorrow. When a wedding came around, you released. And yes, sometimes that meant someone tried to ride a sheep like a horse. You pass 2 teenagers making flower crowns for frogs. A grandmother is napping in a chair while someone paints her shoes. A man offers you pickled eggs from a pouch. You decline. This isn't a tidy celebration. It's communal combustion, an explosion of relief mischief and fermented everything. The church disapproved, of course. Many clergy wrote stern letters about wedding parties becoming dens of sin. But even they knew try to stop it and you'd have a riot instead. So they watched, and occasionally joined in. You hear about 1 monk who attended a wedding to keep order, then spent the next day asleep in a hay cart with a chicken on his head. And maybe that's the heart of it. Medieval weddings weren't just unions, they were disruptions. Of routine, of silence, of fear. They reminded people that life could still be messy, loud, and oddly hilarious. Tomorrow everything would return to normal. Fields would be plowed, bread would be baked, marriages would become routine. But tonight there's dancing and shouting, and a very suspicious game involving blindfolds and cheese. And as the pig charges by again, now wearing a wedding veil, you realize this might be the most honest part of the whole ceremony. The sun rises slow and soft, filtering in through smoke-stained beams and dusted windows. Someone snores under a table. A tambourine lies in the mud beside a half-eaten turnip. And in the center of it, all surrounded by empty mugs, dented cookware, and 1 inexplicably majestic goose, the newlyweds sleep tangled in a blanket and dreams that for once are quiet. This is the morning after the chaos. Not the bedding night, not the ritual, just the real beginning. You step outside and breathe the cool air. There's a freshness to it even with the faint scent of roasted parsnip and sweat. And around you, the village begins to stir, not in celebration, but in recovery. Someone is sweeping. Someone is already repairing the bench that broke under two dancing cousins. The goat that wore a veil is tied to a post, chewing triumphantly on a discarded garland. And you realize this is the start of marriage. Not the feast, not the vows, not even the moment when they stumbled giggling into their shared bed. But this, the quiet morning, the lingering laughter, the stew pot that still needs scrubbing, the commitment that doesn't shimmer or shout it, just remains. You glance toward the couple's home. She's awake now, hair undone, apron tied hastily. He's bringing her a bowl of oats with a grin and a limp. She rolls her eyes. He hands her the spoon anyway. No one claps, no one watches, except you. Because this is the part that never makes it into ballads. The ever after. You think back through everything you've seen. The hand fastings and hearths, the blood-stained linens and salted thresholds, the laughter, the fear, the sudden gasps, when someone shouted that the bishop had actually danced. And it all leads here, two people who now belong to each other in a way that's practical, invisible, and entirely too human to define. Marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't a singular moment. It was a slow layering of expectations, habits, jokes, and chores. A braid, not a ribbon. A fire that had to be stoked daily. Quiet, smoky, and always slightly uneven. Historians still argue whether marriage was more about survival than love. But maybe it was never meant to be either or. Maybe survival was love. Maybe folding linens together, knowing which herbs calm each other's coughs, learning how to disagree over bread without going to war, maybe that is devotion. You pass a neighbor nodding at the couple's house. She says, "They'll be fine." You ask how she knows. She shrugs. He gave her the dry blanket when it rained. That's enough. It is. Because in this world so full of mud and music rules and broken jugs, being enough is everything. And now, as your journey through the brutal, beautiful banana pie-scented landscape of medieval weddings comes to an end, it's time to leave the couple to their life, their routine, their quiet mornings and noisy evenings, their someday children and one-day arguments, and maybe a second goat, maybe a second. The world will keep spinning. Crops will rise and fall. Plagues will come. But for now, two people are gently building something permanent out of wood wool and whispered promises. And that's the part no feast can top. And now, as the last embers of the fire dim and the village quiets to that warm hush that only comes after celebration, let's slow everything down. Let the music fade into memory, those thudding drums, that off-key lute, the distant laughter that still echoes somewhere behind your eyes. You've wandered through muddy fields, smoky kitchens, and candlelit chapels. You've seen weddings bound by salt and superstition, sealed with bread and survival, and carried forward by little more than hope. And now you rest. Let yourself sink gently into stillness, as if you were curling up beside the hearth in that cottage, the one with creaky floorboards and two people beginning their forever. Let the straw-stuffed mattress settle beneath you, the faint scent of rosemary from someone's wedding wreath still lingering in the air. Breathe in and let it go. There's nothing more to understand tonight. You've seen it all. The vows, the veils, the veal. Stew the wild pig with a ribbon on its tail. And through all of it, the mess and the magic, something steady remained. The quiet human wish to belong to someone. To survive together. To laugh and argue and wake up again to one more ordinary day. And so, wherever you are right now, whatever time it is, however loud your own world might be, know that this moment is just for you. Let the air grow cooler. Let your limbs grow heavier. Let sleep fold itself around you like the blanket they shared on that first imperfect night. And if you dream, May it be of dancing geese, crooked rings, and a love that endures with gentle footsteps through muddy floors.